Hello and welcome to this part 10 of Postman tutorial series, and in this part we are going to see how we can build the request workflow using Postman scripts. In past two sections we saw how we can write scripts in pre-request tab and in test tab. So using both these we are going to build the request workflow for a sample use case. So in case you haven't watched the previous parts, you can visit to my channel and you can watch part 8 and part 9. So when we start a collection run, so till now we have seen that all the requests which are run in the order which we see them in Postman. So either which we see them in the Postman or which we set before we click on that run collection button. So when the collection is running at that point of time, we don't have explored a way by in we can dynamically alter the sequence of our request, or we haven't explored the way in which we can decide the next set of requests depending on some pre or post conditions. So that is what exactly we are looking in this particular section. We can write the behavior of this particular uh, collection run using the built-in function which is called as set next request. So the set next request, we have to give the request ID or the request name which you want to run next at the end of this particular request. So you can add this particular command in your tests tab, and there you can set the next request which you want to run. So you can add some kind of a conditions over there. Let's say if we receive 200 requests, then run the next request as maybe the success flow. If you get 500 requests, then maybe you want to run some other test request. So accordingly you can decide the flow of your API request. This set next request has a scope, I mean, which is the source of your collection run. So if you are running this uh, particular collection, then this set next request can run the requests which are only in that particular collection. If you are running all the requests in a particular folder, then this set next request can run the API request only from that particular folder. You can also pass null to this function which will stop the workflow execution. So null is particularly required. For example, if you want to stop the execution in case of any authentication error or in case of any authorization error where you feel that there is no point in running the next test request. So in that case, you can add this line in your test script and you can stop the execution of your collection. So now we are going to go to Postman and we are going to work on a particular use case, and we will see how we can build the request workflow for that particular use case. So the use case that we are going to consider for the API workflow is as follows. First, we are going to send the post request to the API endpoint, which will help us in creating the user. So the details that we will be passing in our request are the unique email ID and unique full name. And in the response, we will get the ID of the user which has been created using this request. Now we will get that ID, and using that ID, we will make a GET call. So the expectation is that we should receive the details of that particular user in the second call, which will essentially help us to identify whether the create call has worked correctly or not. And the third call that we will make is using that we will delete the user we just now created. So to delete the user, we will again use the ID which was generated as a part of first call. So one thing we have to note here is that first and third call requires the bearer token to be passed as a header, because those calls are the ones which actually make the changes to the resource on server side. So get call is the safe call, as they say, and it doesn't change anything on the server side. So let's open the Postman application and let's see how we can implement the API workflow for this particular use case. So I have opened the Postman application, and as we discussed in our previous sessions that we had created these two collections, collection A and collection B. So I have modified this collection B a bit in order to suit our use case. So first we have this create user request, in which we are going to pass name, email, gender, status and some date fields. and in header we are going to pass this bearer token. Now when we use the same email ID for sending the request, so as I have already created the user using this request, let me show you what happens when you send the same email ID again. So in such a case we get this error saying that the email has already been taken. Now it doesn't work in that way in case if I change anything in this email ID. So if I use this, then the ID gets created correctly on the server side. So now in the response you can see it gives me this ID 1747. So in the next call what I will do is that I will put this ID here. I will make a call which is again the get call, and in the response I'll verify whether the details which I had passed earlier are reflecting correctly, and I am getting the 200 OK response back. So essentially I am getting those users detail back in the response. And lastly, in this delete call I am going to give that ID again. I'm passing the bearer token with that, and I'm going to execute it, which will ultimately delete the user. So after deleting the user, if I again send this request, I get this 404 resource not found error. So this is the workflow. So at the moment you can see I am executing all the 3 requests manually, and I'm changing the value one by one in each of the requests. So now our aim is to automate this API testing of these 3 requests. So let's start one by one. So first thing I'm gonna do is that we are going to use the randomize function for name and email field. So we have already discussed the dynamic variables that are available as a part of Postman. So let's make use of them. So random full name is the function available here. So I use this random full name. Similarly for email ID, let me use random email. So now first 2 things I have taken care of, that for name and email I have now added this dynamic variable. So every time when I run this request, I don't need to think about providing the different email ID. That would be automatically taken care by Postman. So if I fire this request now, you can see some random email ID is generated over here. So this takes care of the first thing. Now let's go to the next thing, and that is about this test part. So let me first cut this particular part. So by default it will be empty, and now what we are going to do is that we want to save the ID which is returned in the response to a particular collection variable. So the idea is we will store this ID in a collection variable, and we will use this collection variable in our later request. So for that, let's go to collection B, and I think I have already created this variable ID. So let me first delete it, and I think I have user underscore ID. So let's use user underscore ID, and let's remove any existing or current value. So initial value I am keeping as empty because I want to initialize this user ID after hitting this post create user request. So now let me come back to create user, and now we want to set the variable as user underscore ID over here. So how we can do that is, first of all let's get the JSON content out of it. So let me use this snippet which we have used earlier, and let me copy the syntax from that in order to get the JSON payload. So this was the, so let me copy this particular sentence here. So now this JSON data has the response payload that we have received, and I am going to create a variable with the name ID, and that value would be picked up from, let me get this again to see how we access JSON data that value. Okay, so the value that we can access here is JSON data, and let me see the path of the ID field. So it is under data ID. So data dot ID. Next thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to add one logger console.log, and here I'm going to print id retrieved from response is, and I'm gonna just print that id which we have retrieved from the response. So next thing is that we want to set the collection variable. So again, let's go to the snippets part, and let's try to set the collection variable. So in this key, I'm going to give this particular user ID value, and in the value I'm going to use it as ID. Now again, I'll add one more statement here so that it will be helpful for me to debug it later, that and it will set. So I'm going to map user ID value is, and here I am gonna just again print this ID, or we can even get the value of a collection variable here. So instead of that, let's do one thing, that let's put this value over here, and here in this variable key I'm gonna put this user underscore ID. So this is my script where first I'll transform I'll create the JSON object from the response that we have got, and then from that JSON object I'll fetch the ID value, I'll print the ID, and later I'll set the user ID value to this ID, and I'll again add one more log here just to ensure that the collection variable is set correctly. So this covers our first create user part. Now we will go to get user. So here, instead of this URI, we need to give again the collection variable. So I again now map this collection variable over here. Similarly, in case of delete user, again I map the same thing. So let's save the changes that we have done to all the request, and let me close this to make it a bit cleaner. And before we run, let's open the console. So let me clear this and let me run. So let me have the delay of 2 seconds in between, and let's run the collection. So we can see all the 3 requests have completed successfully. Now let's go to console and let's see the values that have been populated with the scripts and the dynamic variable that we have added. So you can see this is our post request, and if we see the response body, so in this the ID was returned by the endpoint is 1753. So this ID is now retrieved correctly. The user ID has been set correctly to 1753, and get request now has this ID as 1753. And finally, to this delete request, we are passing that ID value. So now we don't need to manually change anything on all the 3 requests. Whenever we run the collection, all the values would be automatically populated here. Now one more thing that you can do here is that you can create the environment variable for URL. So let me add one username here for URL, and let me take the value. Let me take this particular value. And let me save it. So now what I will do is that here I will give value as URL. So let me hover it over it, so we can see that value is correctly set. So similar URL I will put on the other requests also. So now I have added, now I have now modified the URL and made it as a part of our environment variable. So similar URL variable I can create for prod environment also. Right now I have created for test environment. And last thing I want to put it in the environment variable is the bearer token. So as you know, in this post request and delete request we have the bearer token. So let me again go here, add, and let me add the token, and let me fetch the value from here. And put it over here, and let me save it. So now instead of giving this value, I can give the value as token. Similar way for my delete call also I can do the same. I can put token here, and let me save, and let me save this test environment also. So it is already saved. So let me close these things, and let's run this collection once again. So before that let me clear the console. I think it is not open. Let me open it first. So let me clear it, and let me run the collection. Let me have the gap of 1 millisecond in each request. So now I have run the collection. So all the 3 requests have been executed successfully. Let's check the console. So we can see the 1754 was the user retrieved, and this time if we see the request body, then we can note that new email ID has been used. So similarly, if I run it again, so now 1755 is the user created, and user has been deleted successfully. So this is how we can build, or we can create our API workflow. So I hope these things are clear to you. And what we are going to do next is, now we are going to add one thing, that in case if the user is not created, or if there is any error in creation of this user, in this case we won't be executing any further tests. So our collection should stop the execution in case there are any errors in this create user call. So for that, what I'm going to do is that I will first add the status code check for successful post. In this case, the API that we have created returns the value as 200. So let me add 200 also in this array. So this will verify whether the status is 200 or not. So let's send this request once and see the response. So status code is 200, and the HTTP code received is status is 200. Okay. So we can see that in case if we don't give the correct authorization, for example, I change this token value here, and if I send the request, so we get this authentication failed. So in that case we get this code value as 401, though HTTP status has 200 here, but the code value indicates that this create user request hasn't completed successfully. So now what we want to do is that we want to decide whether to go ahead with get and delete user in case this code is not 201. So what we are going to do is that we are going to again go to test section, and we are going to first retrieve the value of this code. So code is equal to again JSON data dot code. So let me add one loggle over here, console.log value of code is plus code. So we have retrieved the value of code. Next thing that we want to do is we want to check the value. So I'll use the if loop. If code is not equal to 2 not 1, in that case we have to stop the execution of the request. And how we stop the execution? We can see that we use the Postman for this. So in Postman we use the set next request, and here we will give it as null, so that next request won't get executed when we run this collection. And lastly we will add the remaining conditions in else block. So now let's again revise what we have added in script. So first we created the JSON object, we fetched out the code from the JSON response, we check the value of that code. If it is not 201, in that case we set the next request to null, which means that the next request will not get executed and the collection will stop its execution. And in case if it is not 201, in that case it will continue to work as it was as in the normal way. So I'll do also one more thing here. I'll add console.error So I added this message so that whenever we'll see the message, looking at a message, it will be clear to us that the text execution was not completed successfully. So let me change this value again back to token, and let me save it. And let's do one thing. Let's run the collection. So before that, let me start the Postman console. Let me clear, and let's run this collection. So now we can see all the 3 requests have been completed successfully. Here also we can see the ID is generated and the same ID is now deleted. So now what we will do, we'll go to the test environment and we will do some kind of a tweaking with the current value of this particular token. Oops. Let me close this without saving because I accidentally deleted that environment variable altogether. So let me remove few digits from here and let me save it. And now let me run this collection again. So now our token is points to the invalid value, which means that our post request will not be successful, and now as per our script the next get and delete call should not get executed because post request itself has failed. So first thing is, let me clear the console log, and now let me run this. So we can see the post request was executed, but after that the get and the delete was not executed. And if I open the console, we can see here the error log, the test execution aborted, add user is not created. So this way we can stop the execution of a collection on the basis of a particular situation. In fact, we can also add the assertion here. We can add the assertion here for a particular value check, and here we can check validate code, and here we can say that check if the value of code is 201. And if we save this and if we run our collection, so you can see the post request itself will fail because the expected code value is not matching with the value that we have received, and accordingly other requests in the collection will not get executed. So this way you can update your API request flow using the different snippets and user defining the control flow available with us, and accordingly you can adapt it as per your requirement. We can also add similar assertions in get and delete user. We can also have some, we can also use the set next request to another request name. That is also we can do, but at this point of time I think we have demonstrated how to use null. So similar way you can also try to execute the next request. So let's do one thing. Instead of this set next request, we can also use the delete user here. So if I click on this name, let me copy this. So now again this will not execute it correctly, because what I have now written is that in case code is not 201, then instead of aborting, what I am saying is that invoke delete user. So ultimately that is not the correct flow if you look at our functionality, but my intention is just to show you how we can change the sequence of execution of the particular request. So let me save this and let me run the collection. So you can see here post request was executed, but for it error was got as 401, and after that directly delete user was initiated, because in our create user script we had set the next request to be run as delete user. So this is how you can tweak the flow of your API request, and you can implement your test suite in a way which will test your business functionality in the best possible way. I am sure this I hope this video is helpful to you. So thank you for watching this video, and I'm sure you would also try the same things on your Postman application. And if you find this video helpful, then please click on like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.